Okay, now I've covered this topic before on the channel, and this was before the Redcliffe Dolphins joined the NRL, where the NRL places their 18th team, their next expansion team. Now, there are multiple options and locations the NRL could look at. We know there's strong rumours linking the North Sydney Bears or the Central Coast Bears, depending on which of those locations they decide to go with a bid. And obviously, the North Sydney Bears are a former NRL team. They have a very good reserve grade kind of level side in the New South Wales Cup, where a lot of current NRL players have played, so they already have a club structure in place. There's also rumours suggesting that there's another Brisbane team bid potential in the western side of Sydney, with a strong Pacific Islander part of the bid as well. And considering that like 50% of the player base now is Polynesian descent or partial Polynesian descent, that could gain some traction. But we've just had the Dolphins enter into the competition, and Queensland is a massive state in Australia. And of course, when the COVID disrupted seasons of 2020 and 2021, obviously Queensland was a location the NRL did use to host games. Obviously Rockhampton has hosted games recently as well, so they could look outside of the Brisbane Gold Coast area to place a team, and Rockhampton would not be without the realms of possibility. Very great little host city for the NRL during the COVID disrupted seasons. Obviously the North Sydney Bears, if they were to be playing in North Sydney rather than the Central Coast, that adds to an already very congested NRL market, with 9 teams already based in the Sydney area. Obviously the St George Illawarra Dragons split their time between Wollongong and Sydney. However, there is a lot of traction behind that, considering the success of the Dolphins and similar structures off the field with the leagues, clubs, the player base, the internal club structures of player development. There's the potential of a Perth bid. Now, Perth, again, has had a team in the past at the NRL level. Now, there's reasons why Perth, at that time in the late 90s, obviously failed to continue with having a team. Although I think the economic outlook and the growth of Perth as a city has obviously, a lot's happened in the last 20-25 years economically. Perth is a rapidly growing city, and when they take state of origin or games on the road out, with teams rotating through the Perth area, ticket sales are good. They do have the facilities in Perth. They do have a state league in Perth, and there are players of Western Australian heritage playing in the NRL. They could look at another team in Victoria, like Geelong or Melbourne. The Melbourne Storm, we can argue, has the Melbourne Storm been a success off the field in Melbourne? That's the interesting thing. On the field, we know about the product, we know how successful the team is, the structures they've put in place, but the growth of the game in Victoria hasn't really kicked on since 1998, and I think in part that is partly to do with the salary cap scandal and the image damage done, the PR damage done, but again, when games state of origin is taken to Melbourne, it does rather well as on top of the Sydney-Brisbane games. So it'd be interesting to see something there. Adelaide, I think, is the weakest of the big cities for a potential bid. There is obviously Adelaide is not the wealthiest of the big cities in Australia. Yes, the AFL has got a really strong footprint in Adelaide and in South Australia. The NRL hasn't been great at taking on the AFL in their own backyard, whereas the AFL has obviously made significant inroads into traditional rugby league locations. Then we can look at the Northern Territory and Darwin. When games are taken on the road to Darwin, attendances are pretty good for the stadium capacity that they have, but there would have to be massive infrastructure upgrades to the facilities in Darwin. And again, the AFL does draw a lot of players from the Northern Territory, and again, that's AFL territory really, in where they get a lot of players from. Engagement with the community, but it can't be ignored. Darwin, much like Perth, is a rapidly growing city, and that could be a massive boost for just sport in general in the Northern Territory and in Darwin. Tasmania's got its own issues with the AFL right now, and Tasmania does not have a rugby league history of any note. It's more Aussie rules and cricket, and to a certain extent motorsport, and at the moment the AFL is having a bit of an issue with Tasmania and the potential of a 19th team there and a stadium build, and how that whole saga has been drawn out or Will they relocate North Melbourne there? The whole thing's a mess. Tasmanians are not happy with how things are going in regards to sporting infrastructure, and does the state want a professional, high-level sporting team in the state of Tasmania? There isn't an interest from Tasmanians for rugby league, really. Then there's some fans there. There's obviously some fans who've transplanted from Queensland and New South Wales and the other states and territories to Tasmania, but there isn't really the appetite there. And then finally, there is New Zealand. Now, the Warriors have taken a game to Napier, which is in the Hawke's Bay region of the North Island. Sellout crowd. Obviously, the Warriors have spent many years, the last 3 years, transplanted in Australia. Their future was uncertain at points whether they would actually end up fully relocating to Australia. But again, that Polynesian link with half the players now of South Sea Islander origin, a second team in New Zealand could gain traction. Another team in Auckland, maybe a team in Wellington, maybe a team in Hawke's Bay, maybe a team on the South Island like Christchurch, for example, or in Invercargill. Dunedin, potentially. Now, New Zealand has had bids before. When the Gold Coast Titans were admitted, one of the bids that were put forward to the NRL at that time was a New Zealand option. They were looking at the South Island, they looked at the North Island. A lot has happened between the mid-2000s and now. I think the big issue that holds back a second New Zealand team is travel. Yes, you've got the Trans-Tasman Corridor, which is a political agreement and an economic agreement between New Zealand and Australia. But if we have another situation similar to a pandemic or any other issue that may disrupt that trade and social corridor, that's been agreed between the two governments, we could see further issues with, players being able to play, etc., etc. Working visas for those who don't qualify for the Trans-Tasman Corridor in regards to, let's say, British players. If the French were to raise their standard, other European players gaining work permits, visas, etc., there could be issues there. And what players want to, and the other issue is relocating players from Australia to New Zealand, and those players being willing to settle long term. That's been an issue that's hampered the Warriors over the years. So we can look at it. There are options on the table. Now, things that count against each bid, there are pros and cons. Obviously, if the Bears were to decide to stay in North Sydney rather than the Central Coast, the congested Sydney market could hamper them. Perth, the distance, travel is going to be the issue there. That was the issue in the past. That was one of the contributing factors to Perth losing their team in the first place. Adelaide, Adelaide, I mean, is there still that rugby league interest of a high enough level where enough fans want to turn up week in, week out? Now, when State of Origin goes there, crowds are good. But otherwise, is there still that rugby league interest in the state of South Australia? Obviously, the population is Adelaide and then not a lot else in South Australia. Is there the corporate money there to back up a team? Is there the willingness from locals to support rugby league? That is something on a long-term basis outside of the state of origin kind of concept. Another team in the state of Victoria, be it Melbourne or Geelong, again, that's AFL territory, and the NRL isn't very good at battling the AFL for taking it to them in their traditional locations. Yes, the Melbourne Storm have been very, very successful. State of Origin does do well when games are taken there. However, it's an AFL city, and that's a very congested AFL market, very similar to Sydney with the NRL. Northern Territory, it's infrastructure, it's disposable income, as the Northern Territory and Darwin doesn't have necessarily the highest incomes in comparison to the other big, cities in Australia. Then we look at Brisbane and the rest of Queensland. Brisbane, I think, is an under-tapped market, and I think forcing the Broncos and to a certain extent the Gold Coast Titans to now compete with Redcliffe for player development, free agent players who are off contract, for example, I think could be a good thing. But then you've got the rest of Queensland, like Rockhampton, for example, which again, when COVID forced teams to go into bubbles and go in play in Queensland in 2020 and 2021, Rockhampton was a very good host city, although it is on the smaller side, which is a problem. Very similar to Darwin, is there enough disposable income, etc. We know that Ipswich, again in South Queensland, was one of those bidding. The Ipswich bid just fell short again. That corporate money. New Zealand, as I said, the potential of getting the issues of getting players to be willing to relocate from Australia over to the South Island or the North Island, set up roots and stay long term. Tasmania, there's no point going there. The AFL have got enough. The AFL, which has a foothold in Tasmania, is having a nightmare with the stadium redevelopment and infrastructure, and the state government's basically having a running battle with the AFL right now. The NRL has no interest in going to Tasmania. It's never once taken really any interest in the Tasmanian market. It's a low population state. There are issues with the Tasmanian economy. Again, if something similar to a COVID situation, or there was not just a health outbreak, but any kind of disruption to travel, because Tasmania is an island and it's separate from the rest of Australia, travel could be an issue. Trying to again get players to relocate to a very quiet rural backwater, because Tasmania doesn't really have the population either. So there's a lot of but again, it's an opportunity to grow the game. So there's some pros and cons. Please place in the comments section below where you think the 18th NRL team ends up. As I say, we've had like the Bears organisation has sort of been strongly linked with a bid, be it on the Central Coast or in North Sydney, the old North Sydney Oval itself. And there's been the potential of another Queensland Brisbane based bid as well. Not a lot of real rumours or potential bids from other locations, so we'll see. We could most likely see another team in southeast Queensland. I think that's probably where the NRL would like to play safe. That's the safe option. Although if New Zealand was to come in with a second team bid, I think it has some credence. But again, if there's any disruption to travel, the travel distance as well, we could see that bid fall flat. So we shall see what happens. But there we go. That's my view on things. Where does the NRL take its 18th team? We're looking at a time frame of around 2025, maybe 2026. So very similar to time frame to what the Dolphins were given when they finally got over the line for this season, when the expansion process was officially announced. I wouldn't be surprised if some of these potential bids have actually been thinking about this for a lot longer than the time frame, if you think about it. And again, there were 3 bids to be the 17th expansion team. Maybe they resurrect, like Ipswich, for example, or another team in Brisbane, resurrect the bids that fell short for this year. So there's the potential. But we shall see what happens. The NRL cannot stay a 17-team team league, should I say, for much longer, because it is a pain in the arse to schedule. An 18th team is on the way in the next few years. It's just a question of where the NRL decides to go and what direction they decide to go in. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts in the comment section below, and I will have some more content for you very, very soon.